not quite sure I'm ready to preach yet. I'm still marveling at what I just saw and heard. Wasn't that awesome? I don't know if God's still going to answer my prayer. He hasn't yet. I want to be able to multitask too, but... Well, to begin our service today, my sermon today, I want to say that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is on a mission. And we don't have to kind of speculate. We don't have to figure out what his mission is. He actually just says what it is. He says it at the very first chance that he gets. It's in Luke chapter 4, just after he was baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. Then he spent some time in the wilderness being tested and tempted by the devil. But after that, he goes back home to his hometown, and he publicly speaks these words. They are from the prophet Isaiah, a good place to get your mission statement. This is what he says. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That is Jesus' mission. Now, the place where he speaks these words is actually a very interesting place. It is the synagogue. Now, the synagogue in small-town Israel was a very significant place for each town. It was the place where people would gather together to study God's Word. That's what synagogue means. Actually, Gog means place of learning, and syna means together. So they came together to learn. But it also, in a small town, had bigger functions than that. It was the place where people would gather not just to study, but also to worship together. Now, the best place you could worship in Israel was, of course, the temple. But because you were called to worship every Sabbath day, and if you lived far away from the temple and couldn't get there, then you would gather together at the synagogue to worship. But also, the synagogue also had kind of a community connecting function. It was the place where people would come together and share news with one another. So if you were trying to picture what a synagogue, what its function was in small-town Israel, I would say it was kind of like City Hall, the church, and Starbucks all rolled up into one, right? And it's for this reason that the leader of the synagogue, the arche synagogue, which is the Greek word for it, the leader of the synagogue had a great deal of power in the community. Because he, and I say he because back then it was only men could be the leader of the synagogue according to the laws. Back then, he was in charge of keeping order within the synagogue. He could control what was talked about, and that in turn gave him the ability to kind of keep order in the whole community. And the way he did this was through two very interesting tools that he had. Tools that probably would have been much more significant to that culture back then than they are to our culture now, although you might give me some argument about this. The tools were honor and shame. And the arche synagogue, the leader of the synagogue, had the power to give out both honor and both shame. Now, honor was something that, well, it was something that everybody in that culture wanted, because it gave them respect. It gave them significance. If you were honored by the leader of the synagogue, then you could hold your head up high. You could have some pride. On the other hand, if you were shamed by the leader of the synagogue, then you were discredited. Your status in the community was diminished. You had to kind of slump over your shoulders and look down and have a frown upon your face. And that's where all the leader of the synagogue's power came from, because people gave him the power to give honor, and to give shame. Well, all of this to kind of set up our story that we just read from the Gospel of Luke. You see, it takes place in a small town somewhere between Galilee and Jerusalem. We hear in Luke chapter 11 that Jesus is now on his journey from the place where he spent most of his time teaching, his home region of Galilee. Now he's going up to Jerusalem. In between Galilee and Jerusalem, he came through some small towns. And because he was a teacher of growing fame and growing reputation, he was often asked to come on the Sabbath day and to bring his teaching, to teach. And that's what's going on. We are in the middle of this synagogue, and he is in the middle of his teaching. And right at the beginning of the story, we hear everything's going well, it's flowing smoothly, it's any other typical day at the synagogue. But then right in the midst of that, all of a sudden, the order of the way things are supposed to be gets disruptive. Maybe you can hear that in the way Luke tells the story. The way people told stories back then is a little bit different, but maybe you can catch it. It goes like this. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman. Right in the midst of his teaching, she just kind of shows up. One of those things that all of a sudden everybody just kind of, something happens and everybody now is instantly distracted, right? Maybe you can picture it. Maybe you can even picture the woman. Here's how she's described. A woman with a spirit that has crippled her for over 18 years. She was bent over and quite unable to stand up straight. That's as much of a description as we get from her. I'm just wondering how visual you are in your mind as you hear those words. Can you picture who this woman is? Do you? Do you have a picture of her in her? I do. Now, we don't get any other details about her, but can you imagine what her story is? I think Luke wants to imagine what her story is. Here's how I imagine it. 18 years before this day, people were very concerned about her. When she first had her back injury or came down with whatever she was dealing with, people were praying for her. They put her on the prayer list. They were sending her get well cards. They were bringing her meals. They were recommending good doctors to her. But somewhere, after she wasn't getting any better, people had to go back to their routine, right? I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to have somebody on the prayer list for 18 years, right? So at some point, her suffering just became inconvenient. It just became a normal part of the daily life. It became a part of the order, right? That's what I picture. And Luke, I think, is making an incredibly important point in this story. And it's a point about human dignity. You know what dignity is? I mean, it's a word I think that's often used, but I'm not sure how often we think about it as a definition. I looked up in the dictionary, and it said dignity is the state of being worthy of honor. I thought that's pretty interesting. Honor, right? Dignity is the state of being worthy of honor. And for this woman, I believe Luke is trying to show us how her dignity has been stripped away from her. Maybe it's the way that her name isn't mentioned. She's just referred to as woman, right? It's kind of weird, right? Woman. My mind just went in a different place. That is no way to get any respect in my house. Honey, that's more like it. Or maybe it's the way that she's just simply described.